In this video, we'll look at every person executed in the United States in 2011. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments whether your state has the death penalty or not. On January 6, 2011, Billy Don Alverson was executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma. But the story behind that sentence began more than a decade earlier inside a convenience store in Tulsa, Oklahoma. On the night of February 26, 1995, Richard Yost stood behind the counter of a Quick Trip convenience store. He was just 30 years old, working the late shift and expecting another quiet evening. But four men walked in with something else in mind, and Billy Don Alverson was one of them. The robbery turned brutal fast. When Richard resisted, the men dragged him into a cooler in the back of the store, cuffed his wrists, and started beating him with a baseball bat. The autopsy would count 54 separate blows. Most of the attack was caught on surveillance video. It was methodical, relentless, and cold. Billy later denied swinging the bat, but the jury saw him as a full participant in the crime. Each of the four men was convicted of first-degree murder. Darwin Brown, one of Billy's accomplices, was executed in 2009. Michael Wilson would follow in 2014. The fourth man, Richard Harjo, received a sentence of life without parole. Billy was sentenced to death in 1997. He spent 14 years on death row. Before the execution, he requested a large pepperoni and Italian sausage pizza and a big Dr. Pepper. When the moment came, he turned to face the victim's family and spoke clearly. "First, to the Yost family, I would like to say I'm sorry. Forgive me," he said. Then he turned to his own family who sat behind the glass. "I'm all right. God is good. Don't you cry. Don't do it. I'm all right." He looked at each of them and mouthed, "I love you," blowing a kiss before the drugs began to flow. Billy Don Alverson was executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma at 6:10 p.m. on January 6, 2011. He was 39 years old. And that was the first death row inmate to die in 2011. Let's take a look at the second person whose execution was scheduled just 5 days later. What did he do? On the night of January 27, 1994, Jeffrey Matthews and his cousin Tracy Dyer forced their way into a small home near Rosedale, Oklahoma. Inside lived Otis and Minnie Short, an elderly couple in their 70s. Otis was Jeffrey's great-uncle who had once helped raise him. Jeffrey carried a .45 caliber pistol and Tracy brought a knife. And they weren't just there to visit. They were there for money. Otis had been cautious with his savings and kept it close, at home. When Otis resisted giving it up, Jeffrey raised the pistol and fired a shot into his uncle's head. Tracy cut Minnie's throat. They then fled with about $500 in cash, a .32 caliber pistol, and a prescription bottle of Xanax belonging to Minnie. Luckily, Minnie survived the attack and was able to tell investigators what happened. Tracy quickly pleaded guilty and took a life sentence without parole. Jeffrey was sentenced to death in 1995 and spent 16 years on death row. In his final hours, Jeffrey requested a deep dish meat lover's pizza, deep-fried jumbo shrimp, 2 hush puppies, and vinegar sauce. When the time came, he kept his tone light but direct. "Let my mother know I love her. I just want to thank everyone for their support. I also want to thank all my buddies on death row. I hear you banging. I hate to see you all in this situation," he said. "I'm sitting here enjoying my last moments. Enjoy your lives. I think that governor's phone is broke. He hadn't called yet." Jeffrey David Matthews was executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma at 6:09 p.m. on January 11, 2011. He was 38 years old. Oof, that was just cold. Now let's continue with the next one. On the night of October 17, 1988, anger turned deadly in a quiet Alabama neighborhood. Leroy White had already shown what he was capable of weeks earlier. He'd shot his estranged wife, Ruby, in the leg after she filed for divorce, but she didn't press charges. Maybe she still hoped he'd stop. But Leroy didn't stop there. That night, Ruby was at her sister Stella's house. It should have been safe, but Leroy showed up carrying a shotgun and he blasted through the front door. Stella was the first in his sight, and he didn't think twice. He shot her in the chest and shoulder, then walked out, calmly returned to his car, reloaded, and came back. Ruby tried to run, but Leroy raised the shotgun again and fired. She collapsed outside in the yard, but that still wasn't enough for him. He reloaded once more and stood over her, pulling the trigger again. The autopsy later revealed she'd been shot in the arm, chest, neck, and leg. She died where she fell. Stella survived her wounds and later told the jury everything. In 1989, Leroy was sentenced to death. He waited 21 years on Alabama's death row. On the day of his execution, he turned down a special meal. Instead, he bought a cheeseburger from a vending machine, a V8 juice, pork skins, and a Yoo-hoo. He didn't offer any final words. Leroy White was executed by lethal injection in Alabama at 9:10 p.m. on January 13, 2011. He was 52 years old. He was gone, but someone else was still waiting for his final day. Let's take a look. July 12, 1988, was sweltering in Atlanta. Julie Love, a 27-year-old fitness instructor and former beauty queen, had run out of gas on her way to meet her fiancé. She parked her car, stepped out, and started walking, unaware that she was being watched. Emmanuel Hammond sat behind the wheel of a car, his girlfriend Janice Weldon beside him, and her cousin, Maurice Porter, in the back. They spotted Julie walking and circled back around. At first, they offered a ride, but Julie declined. Minutes later, they returned. This time, Emmanuel got out, holding a sawed-off shotgun, and forced Julie into the car. There was no escape. Inside her purse, they found cash and ATM cards. They drove to a bank and demanded her PIN, but it didn't work. That's when things turned. Emmanuel beat her with the shotgun, and Maurice r***ed her. Janice was shaken and demanded to go home. Emmanuel dropped her off like it was nothing. With Julie still tied up, Emmanuel and Maurice drove to a wooded area. Emmanuel raised the shotgun and fired. He later bragged about it, said he blew the side of her face off. Then they dumped her in a trash pile like she never mattered. Weeks passed, then months, but Julie's body wasn't found. Eventually, Emmanuel sold the shotgun and Janice pawned Julie's earrings. Then Emmanuel made a mistake. He beat Janice and threatened to kill her. And in fear, Janice went to the police. She told them everything, how Julie had begged, how Emmanuel had smiled while she screamed. She then led them to the place where Julie's bones lay hidden, and Emmanuel was arrested. While in jail, he tried to hire a hitman to kill Janice for talking. Emmanuel was sentenced to death on March 15, 1990. He spent 21 years on death row. For his final meal, he chose fried chicken, French fries, corn on the cob, jalapeno peppers, mint chocolate chip ice cream, and cherry limeade. He spoke no last words. Emmanuel Hammond was executed by lethal injection in Georgia at 11:39 p.m. on January 25, 2011. He was 45 years old. And it wasn't long before another inmate followed. Let's look at what he did and what he chose for his final meal. The morning of January 11, 1991, 11-year-old Alyssa Self-Braun stepped outside her St. Louis home before sunrise. She was heading to the bus stop, bundled up and carrying her school bag. Alyssa was gifted, bright, kind, the kind of child who made teachers proud. But she never arrived at school that day. By 11 a.m., police were searching the streets. 4 days later, Alyssa's body was found in the St. Francis River, over 130 miles from home, strangled to death. Investigators worked backward, piecing together a trail that led them to Martin Link. He'd been pulled over during a traffic stop, but instead of complying, he ran. After a high-speed chase, police searched his car. Inside, they found a jar of petroleum jelly. Martin's fingerprints were on it. Traces of blood were mixed into the jelly. Martin was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death on October 13, 1995. He spent 15 years on death row, filing appeals, fighting the clock. Each one failed. On the evening of February 8, 2011, Martin was served his final meal: sausage and pepperoni pizza, lasagna, garlic bread, a chef's salad, New York-style cheesecake, a strawberry milkshake, and a cold Dr. Pepper. As midnight approached, Martin was led to the execution chamber. When asked for his final words, he didn't apologize. Instead, he aimed at the justice system itself. The state says killing is wrong, so why do they do it? For revenge. Where is the closure? There is none. The death penalty is an act of revenge. Martin Link was pronounced dead by lethal injection at 12:15 a.m. in Missouri. He was 47 years old. Later that month, another execution was planned. On February 15, 2011, after spending 11 years on death row, Michael Wayne Hall was executed in Texas. But what did he do, and what did he choose for his final meal? Let's take a look. The morning of February 15, 1998, was cold and still. Michael Hall and Robert Neville waited in a parked car near the Kroger grocery store in Arlington, Texas. Amy Robinson was pedaling toward her shift, her bike cutting through the wind. Michael and Robert had come prepared: rifles, a crossbow, ammo, and a plan that would end in blood. Amy had once worked with them, and that familiarity was enough. They offered her a ride, and she got in. She had no reason to fear them. They drove her 12 miles out of town into open country. Robert pulled off the road, claiming they had a flat tire, and Amy stepped out of the car. Then everything broke open. First, Michael shot her in the leg with a pellet gun, and she cried out. Later, Robert missed several times with his crossbow. They laughed while she limped and begged. Then Robert grabbed the .22 rifle and fired into her chest. Amy fell, but Michael kept shooting her with the pellet gun. Finally, Robert stepped forward and shot her once more, in the head. They left her body and her bicycle in the dirt and drove off. Days later, they returned. Amy was still there. Robert fired again. Then Michael leaned down and pulled money and keys from her pocket. Weeks passed, and Michael's mother reported him missing. His stepbrother cracked first, telling police that Michael had confessed to killing Amy. But by the time police found the body, Michael and Robert were on the run, trying to cross into Mexico. But they didn't make it. Arrested and cuffed, they showed no remorse. In a taped interview, they grinned and bragged about what they'd done. Michael later claimed his life was sucky ass, and he just wanted to kill someone. That's all it took. He was sentenced to death on February 23, 2000, and spent 11 years on death row. On the evening of February 15, 2011, exactly 13 years to the day since Amy's murder, Michael ate his last meal: chicken cooked 3 ways, pizza, brownies, sweet iced tea, milk, and vanilla pudding. When asked if he had any final words, he looked toward Amy's family. "I would like to give my sincere apology to Amy's family. We caused a lot of heartache, grief, pain, and suffering, and I am sorry. I know it won't bring her back. I wish I could take it back, but I can't." Michael Hall was pronounced dead by lethal injection at 6:23 p.m. in Texas. He was 31 years old. And as the clock ticked forward, another death row inmate stepped into the chamber just 2 days later. But what did he do? On February 1st, 1982, Frank Spisak stepped into a men's restroom at Cleveland State University. He was dressed like a man trying to channel Hitler: slicked back hair, stiff suits, and a trimmed mustache. But under the costume, Frank carried a .22 caliber pistol. He pulled it and shot a 57-year-old preacher, Reverend Horace Rickerson, point blank. It was the start of a self-declared mission to clean up the city. But Frank wasn't done. Over the next few months, he hunted strangers. On August 27th, he shot and killed 50-year-old Timothy Sheehan in another CSU restroom. 3 days later, he murdered 17-year-old Brian Warford, a student waiting at a nearby bus stop. Both victims were ambushed and shot repeatedly. One man survived, John Hardaway. Frank shot him 7 times on a train platform, but he lived to testify. A woman named Coletta Dart also escaped when Frank cornered her in a campus bathroom. She shoved him, ran, and dodged his bullets. Eventually, Frank was arrested in September after neighbors reported him firing his gun out of an apartment window. When police found the weapon, it matched the bullets from the murders. Inside the apartment, they also found Nazi literature and a handwritten list of targets. Frank confessed, but later told the jury that God had given him the orders. He was sentenced to death in September 1983. He spent 27 years on death row. Frank didn't ask for mercy. In his final moments, he recited verses from Revelation in German, but he skipped the part about murderers facing eternal fire. He ate spaghetti, salad, chocolate cake, and drank coffee before the end. He was executed by lethal injection in Ohio on February 17, 2011, and pronounced dead 10:34 a.m. Frank Spisak was 59 years old. That was brutal. Now let's see what the next death row inmate did and what he chose for his final meal. On February 20, 2002, inside a quiet Houston apartment, a man hit his breaking point. Timothy Adams had been struggling. His marriage to Emma was falling apart, and he feared she would take their 19-month-old son, Tim Jr., away for good. When she came back that day to collect her things, she brought her older son, Andrew, with her. But what she didn't know was that Timothy had a gun tucked away. When she walked in, he was holding it. Emma placed little Tim Jr. down, confused but calm. She reached for the phone and tried to call 911. As she dialed, Timothy raised the gun and fired. The bullet brushed her back. She dropped the phone and ran with Andrew out the front door, screaming for help, leaving her young son behind. SWAT surrounded the apartment where Timothy was alone with his son. When officers entered, they found Tim Jr. dead on the floor, 2 gunshots to his chest. Timothy later told investigators that he didn't want his son to grow up in a broken family, and he'd acted in a moment of rage and despair. He pleaded guilty to capital murder, and a jury gave him the death penalty in March 2003. He spent the next 8 years on death row. When his final day came, Timothy made no last statement. He requested fried chicken, French fries, lemon cake, and drank root beer and Sprite. He was executed by lethal injection in Texas on February 22, 2011. Timothy Adams was 42 years old. And with February executions done, let's continue with the month of March. Keep watching because some of them are outright disturbing. It was March 21, 1994, when 20-year-old Johnnie Baston walked into Continental Wigs and Things in downtown Toledo, Ohio. The shop was owned by Chong Hoon Ma, a 53-year-old Korean immigrant. The store sold wigs, sports gear, and other accessories. But that day, Chong never came home. His wife found the shop still lit and unlocked, the cash register open and emptied. She stepped into the back storage room and found him lying there, a single bullet to the head. Nothing else moved in the quiet room. Police found no fingerprints and no eyewitnesses. But inside the home where Johnnie had been staying, they found starter jackets and sports hats, like those missing from the store. When officers arrested him at a church event in Sandusky, they discovered a .45 caliber handgun in his luggage. Ballistics confirmed it. It was the same gun that killed Chong. Johnnie confessed to the robbery but claimed he didn't pull the trigger. He blamed a man named Ray, but there was no trace of anyone else at the scene, no one to back up his story. He was arrested just days after the murder. In 1995, he was sentenced to death. Chong's family had asked for life without parole, but the judge chose death instead. Johnnie spent 16 years on death row. He didn't ask for a final meal, and when the day came, March 10, 2011, he offered a long, emotional statement. I suggest you pause the video right now if you want to read his final words in detail. Long story short, he apologized to his family, asked them to protect his children, and thanked the people who had sent him letters from across the world. He said he had once felt worthless, but in those final years, he'd learned he mattered to someone. Johnnie Baston was 37 years old. He was gone, and it wasn't long before another name followed. But what did he do to deserve the death penalty? It was just after midnight on December 27, 1989, when Eric King stepped into a quiet convenience store in Phoenix while carrying a loaded .357 handgun. The store was nearly empty. Just two men inside, Ron Barman, the clerk behind the counter, and Richard Butts, the security guard standing near the front. Eric didn't hesitate. He lifted the gun and shot Ron without a word. A second shot followed, this time aimed at Richard. When it was over, both men lay dying, the store silent, but for the hum of the security cameras recording every second. Outside, a driver noticed Richard's body on the pavement. As she picked up her phone to call 911, she watched a man in a sweater approach the guard, bend down, and carefully wipe the blood from his holster with a cloth. He didn't run, he just walked away. A few blocks from the store, Nikita Hill, who knew Eric from the neighborhood, saw him toss something into a dumpster. It was a plastic bag. Later, detectives would find inside it the same gun used in the killings and the distinctive sweater. When police arrested Eric, he didn't deny being there. He'd been out of prison for barely a year. His last sentence was for rape and kidnapping, and now he was going back. In 1991, a jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. He didn't fight it. He didn't talk to the press. And he never admitted why he did it. On March 29, 2011, Eric John King was strapped to the gurney at Arizona State Prison. He'd spent 20 years waiting for this moment. His last meal was fried catfish, collard greens, candied yams, cornbread, chocolate cake with ice cream, and cream soda. He said nothing before the drugs entered his veins. Eric King was 47 years old. Now let's continue to the last execution scheduled for March. William Boyd was 20 years old when he and a friend, Robert Milstead, carried out a violent double murder in Anniston, Alabama. Their victims were Fred Blackman, 76, and his daughter-in-law, Evelyn Blackman, 41. On March 26, 1986, William and Robert broke into the Blackman home. They tied up Fred and Evelyn and tricked them into believing that Evelyn's daughter had been kidnapped. Then, under pressure, Fred was forced to go with the men to a bank and withdraw $5,000 in cash. Once they had the money, Boyd and Robert drove Fred and Evelyn into the woods. There, both victims were beaten and shot to death. The cruelty didn't end there. William and Robert later returned to the scene to hide the bodies. Fred's body was stuffed into the trunk of his own car and dumped into the Coosa River. Evelyn's body was forced into a metal drum, but not before it was hacked with an axe to make her fit inside. That drum was also thrown into the river. After their arrests, both Boyd and Robert gave multiple statements to the police, each blaming the other for the killings. But it was Robert who took a plea deal. He got a life sentence in exchange for testifying against William. William declined to give any final words. His last meal included chicken, French fries, applesauce, a tomato, and an orange drink. From the vending machines, he added a meatball sandwich, a Philly cheesesteak, a V8 splash, and coffee. William Boyd spent 24 years on death row before he was executed by lethal injection on March 31, 2011, in Alabama. He was 45. From one state to another, death row kept moving. Let's continue. Clarence Carter was already in jail for a serious crime when he killed again. He had called himself a hitman for drug dealers in Cincinnati and was waiting to be sentenced for a murder. But in January 1989, Clarence added another body to his name, this time inside the jail. Clarence and Johnnie had argued before, once about what to watch on TV. Clarence punched him that time, but Nothing serious happened. Then, on January 11, 1989, Clarence snapped. He attacked Johnnie inside their jail unit, choking and beating him for 25 minutes. Other inmates watched as Clarence kicked and punched Johnnie over and over. At one point, he even stopped to wipe the blood off his shoes, then kept going. Johnnie's mother later shared he was so badly beaten she couldn't even recognize him. He died 2 weeks later. And Clarence didn't try to hide what he'd done. He was charged with another murder and sentenced to death in August 1989. He stayed on death row for more than 21 years. On the day of his execution, Clarence didn't want a special last meal. He just ate some dates, tuna, and bread. At 10:25 a.m. on April 12, 2011, he was put to death by lethal injection in Ohio. Before he died, Clarence said he was sorry. "I'd like to say I'm sorry for what I did, especially to his mother. I ask God for forgiveness and them for forgiveness." He was 49 years old. That was brutal. Let's look at the next death row inmate scheduled for execution. On the warm July night of 2001, Cary Kerr sat in a Fort Worth nightclub beside two women, Pamela Horton and Jennifer York. Pamela, 34 years old, knew Cary. They lived in the same trailer park. To her, he was the kind of man who passed for decent, polite, friendly, maybe a little rough around the edges, but safe enough. That night, Pamela drank heavily. When she said she was ready to leave, Jennifer wasn't. Cary offered to give her a ride, and the two disappeared into the Texas night. But he didn't take her home. Sometime after midnight, Pamela was raped and strangled. She died with a blood alcohol level more than 5 times the legal limit. Her body was dumped in the street like trash. At 2 a.m., a cab driver saw her lying on the asphalt and called for help. But when the paramedics arrived, Cary approached them. Calm and composed, he claimed he found her body. Then came the missteps. There was a purse in his car, and Cary handed it over, pretending not to know whose it was. Inside, officers found a broken hair clip. And back at Cary's trailer, a search turned up torn underwear and a plastic piece that matched the clip. On Cary's face, investigators pulled a strand of long blonde hair, Pamela's. Her DNA was also on his bedsheets, and the semen found in her mouth was a match for his. Cary never denied being with Pamela that night, but he claimed he didn't kill her. At trial, the forensic evidence told a different story. Cary was sentenced to death in March 2003 and spent 8 years on death row. His last meal was a feast. He requested pizza, fried chicken, pork ribs, tacos, lasagna, cheeseburger, quiche with broccoli, and ice cream. On May 3, 2011, he was strapped to a gurney in the execution chamber at Huntsville. As the drugs flowed, he used his final breath to maintain his innocence. "To the state of Texas, I'm an innocent man. Never trust a court-appointed attorney," he said. Then he muttered, "Check that DNA. Check Scott." Here we go, Lord Jesus. Jesus. He was pronounced dead at 6:19 p.m. He was 46 years old. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear what the next man did. On the morning of December 5, 2005, inside the walls of Perry Correctional Institution, Jeffrey Motts strangled his cellmate, 26-year-old Charles Martin. The two men had a history. Tensions over a stolen radio and a discovered shank led both to ask prison staff not to house them together, but their requests were ignored. Jeffrey claimed it started with an argument. He snapped and knocked Charles unconscious, tied him up, and waited. When Charles came to, he begged for his life, but Jeffrey ignored his pleas and choked him for 5 minutes. Then he ate breakfast and smoked a cigarette. Afterward, he dragged the body into the common area, kicked Charles in the head, and told the room, "This is what snitches get." The victim, Charles, had just 3 weeks left on his 5-year sentence. In his confession, Jeffrey said that he was already serving 2 life sentences. Another wouldn't matter. He waived his appeals and asked the court for a death sentence. In 1995, at age 20, he broke into the Spartanburg home of his 79-year-old great-uncle Clyde Canby. Clyde walked in during the robbery, and Jeffrey shot him. When Clyde's 73-year-old wife Etta Osteen came to check on him, he shot her too. He stole a few $100s and fled. That crime earned him 2 life sentences. By that time, he had nothing to lose. Jeffrey Motts spent nearly 3 years on death row. From the start, he declined to fight it. He welcomed it. His final meal included pizza, fried fish, popcorn shrimp, French fries, sweet tea, and cherry cheesecake. His attorney read a final statement as he lay on the gurney. "To my mom and grandma, Happy Mother's Day. I know this is a sad one, but let us remember the good times. I am finally free and at peace in heaven." He apologized to the families of his victims and warned others. "I was the child everyone wanted their children around until I got on drugs. Drugs will destroy your life." Jeffrey Motts was executed by lethal injection in South Carolina on May 6, 2011, at 6:17 p.m. He was 36 years old. Well, that was something. Let's continue with the execution that was scheduled just 4 days later. On the evening of October 18, 1998, Benny Joe Stevens climbed into his truck with a belt full of shotgun shells and a clear target in mind. His ex-wife, Glenda, had remarried and was raising their daughter Erica with her new husband, Wesley Reed. 11-year-old Dylan Lee, Glenda's son from another relationship, and Dylan's friend, 10-year-old Heath Pounds, were also at the trailer that night. Benny Joe had been thinking. He expected a workers' compensation payout soon, but also feared it would go toward back child support. That day, his new wife Lauren saw him lay out his guns and fill the belt with shells. He left home without a word. When he arrived at the trailer just after dark, Wesley opened the sliding glass door and asked, "Benny Joe, can I help you?" A gunshot answered. Erica ran to grab her younger brother and his friend, but Benny shot her in the back. She dropped to the floor and crawled into the bathroom, hiding in the tub as her mother screamed. Glenda pleaded for her children, but Benny pulled the trigger. "Bitch, I told you I'd kill you one day," he said, and fired again. Erica managed to escape through a window and ran barefoot to a neighbor's house, bleeding and in shock. All 4 inside, Glenda, Wesley, Dylan, and Heath, were dead. When Benny returned home, Lauren asked what he had done. "I just killed a family," he told her. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death in 1999. He spent 11 years on death row. For his final meal, Benny requested 4 fried catfish, hush puppies, French fries, barbecue ribs with extra sauce, coleslaw, hot peach cobbler, half a gallon of Bluebell vanilla ice cream, 2 Cokes, and a sliced red tomato. As he lay on the gurney, he looked toward the witness room. "I am sorry, Lord knows I am sorry. What I've taken from God and you, I can't replace. I'm sorry." He asked them to read their Bibles and added, "Don't let me be a stumbling block to your salvation. I'm not worth it. That's it." He was executed by lethal injection in Mississippi on May 10, 2011, at 6:22 p.m. Benny Joe Stevens was 52 years old. A week later, the next execution was scheduled. On April 24, 1984, Daniel Bedford couldn't let go. His ex-girlfriend, 25-year-old Gwen Topford, had moved on, but he hadn't. That night, he made his second attempt in days to win her back, or, as he later put it, to rekindle their prior romance. But Gwen wasn't interested. She had a new boyfriend now, 27-year-old John Smith. At 2:30 in the morning, Gwen's roommate, Joanne, woke up to the sound of gunfire. Daniel had broken into the apartment with 2 guns. Inside, he and John struggled briefly before Daniel opened fire, killing him. Gwen ran, screaming, into Joanne's room, but Daniel followed her, raised the shotgun again, and fired. She didn't survive the attack. Daniel fled the state, heading for Tennessee. He was arrested not long after and confessed to the murders. He was sentenced to death in 1984 and spent 27 years on death row. Daniel didn't ask for a special meal. He ate the regular prison dinner of turnip greens, oven brown potatoes, graham crackers, and wheat bread. As a last request, he was given a 2-liter bottle of cola. Before the drugs took effect, Daniel said, "I love you, Shell. Love you all. God bless you." He was executed by lethal injection in Ohio on May 17, 2011 at 11:18 a.m. Daniel Bedford was 63 years old. But that wasn't all, as another execution was scheduled for the same day. In Mississippi, Rodney Gray was waiting for his final moments. But what did he do? On August 15, 1994, 79-year-old Grace Blackwell pulled into her bank's drive-thru in Jasper County. She handed over a blank check and quietly asked for $1,200, but something about it felt wrong to the teller. Clothes hanging in the back seat blocked her view, and Grace's voice sounded tense. As the teller handed over the money, Grace said, I'm hurrying. Then she drove off. The teller contacted police. When officers went to Grace's home, they found the front door open and the phone line cut. She wasn't there. Witnesses later reported seeing her car driven by a young black man. One of them identified the driver as Rodney Gray. Hours later, Grace's body was found dumped off a bridge in Newton County. She had been shot in the mouth with a shotgun, raped, and run over by a vehicle. Rodney was arrested the same day. While in jail, he called his girlfriend Mildred Curry and told her where to find hidden money. Police searched her trailer and found $1,123 stuffed inside a bathroom vent. Behind her trailer, they also found Rodney's bloody clothes and boots. DNA from Grace's assault matched Rodney. The odds of it being someone else were 1 in 446 million. He was sentenced to death in 1996 and spent 15 years on death row. He declined a special last meal and didn't speak any final words before his execution. Rodney Gray was executed by lethal injection in Mississippi on May 17, 2011 at 6:12 p.m. He was 38 years old. He was gone, but death row wasn't done yet. 2 days later, the next execution was scheduled. But what did he do, and what were his final moments like? Let's take a look. On the morning of February 15, 1992, Jason Williams returned to the trailer where he had been staying in Irvington, Alabama. He was 23, high on crack, LSD, and alcohol, and had just gotten off the phone with his estranged wife. It was barely past 6 a.m. Inside the trailer was 46-year-old Gerald Paravicini, the man who had taken him in. Jason picked up a .22 rifle and shot Gerald without warning. He then beat Gerald's wife and shot her 16-year-old son in the face. But it didn't end there. Jason walked to the home of their neighbors, the Barber family. Linda was getting ready for work at the post office, and her husband Freddie was having coffee in the kitchen. Their son Brian was still asleep. Jason shot all three of them. Brad, the youngest Barber at 16, was shot in the hand but managed to escape. Jason then stole the family's van, grabbed some cash and credit cards, and fled to Mississippi. When police arrested him, Jason said he didn't remember the killings. He told them he had tossed the rifle off a bridge. The trail of destruction he left behind had already devastated 2 families and shaken a small Alabama town. Jason was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death by December 1992. He spent 18 years on death row. He declined a special last meal, instead eating chicken wings and sandwiches from the vending machines. Just before the lethal injection began, Jason looked toward the families and said, "I hope that the families of the victims forgive me for what I've done." Jason Orrick Williams was executed in Alabama on May 19, 2011, at 6:19 p.m. He was 42 years old. That was brutal. Now let's see what the next death row inmate did and what he chose for his final meal. On May 9, 1984, 13-year-old Christy Fornoff was out collecting payments for her newspaper route in Tempe, Arizona, but she never made it home. Her parents searched, neighbors joined in, and police brought dogs to comb the area. But Christy had vanished. 2 days later, Donald Beaty, a 29-year-old maintenance man at the same apartment complex, was spotted standing next to a trash bin. Wrapped in a sheet beside it was Christy's body. When someone approached, Donald said he had just found her and had already called the police. But that wasn't true. No call had been made. The investigation turned quickly. Inside Donald's apartment, police found vomit in his closet that matched Christy's, along with hairs consistent with hers. At first, the case stalled, and his first trial ended without a verdict. But then a jail psychiatrist came forward. Donald had confessed. He said he hadn't meant to kill her, only to quiet her screaming. He put his hand over her mouth, and she suffocated on her own vomit. The jury found him guilty of rape and murder. He was sentenced to death in 1985 and spent 26 years on death row. For his final meal, Donald asked for a beef chimichanga with salsa and guacamole, a double cheeseburger with everything, fries, Rocky Road ice cream, and a Diet Pepsi. Just before the drugs were administered, Donald spoke. "I just want to say to the Fornoff family, I'm sorry. God will let you see her again. Freddie, I love you. I kept my promise. Thank you for being here for me." Donald Edward Beaty was executed by lethal injection in Arizona on May 25, 2011, at 7:38 p.m. He was 56 years old. That was it for the month of May. Let's continue with the executions scheduled in June. On December 29, 1988, Gayland Bradford walked into a Dallas grocery store with a pistol tucked in his waistband and a plan to get money fast. And he wasn't alone. His accomplice, Vandren Seymour, came along for backup, but it was Gayland who pulled the trigger. Inside the store, 29-year-old security guard Brian Williams was on duty. Without warning, Gayland shot Brian in the back. As Brian fell, Gayland kept firing. The store clerk hid behind some displays while Gayland shouted at Vandren to grab whatever Brian had. Vandren took $7 and some personal belongings from Brian's lifeless body. Then the two fled. However, a surveillance camera recorded the entire attack, and the footage showed clearly that Brian was ambushed. Gayland would later claim the shooting started accidentally and that he fired more shots in self-defense. But that story didn't hold up. The video showed something else. No warning, just bullets. Gayland's girlfriend testified that shortly before the shooting, he told her he was leaving to make some money and showed her the pistol. When police arrested him, they found 3 guns in his home, along with cocaine and marijuana. He confessed to the robbery, but stuck to his self-defense claim in court. At the time of the murder, Gayland was already on parole for a previous robbery. This time, there would be no second chance. He was sentenced to death in 1990, and after years of appeals, the sentence was carried out. He spent 21 years on death row. For his final meal, Gayland ordered chicken with jalapenos, peanut butter cake, butter rolls, 2 steak and cheese omelets, hash browns with ketchup, and a root beer. Just before the lethal injection, Gayland looked at his friend Noel Martin, the only person there for him. "I love you, man," he said. "You have been there for me. Through thick and thin, I am at peace. We have no more worries, just as I have no more worries for the victim's family. May you be at peace also." Gayland Charles Bradford was executed by lethal injection in Texas on June 1, 2011, at 6:25 p.m. He was 42 years old. For the next 2 weeks, Texas's death chamber remained silent, until June 16th, when the next inmate began counting down his final hours. Lee Taylor was just 16 when he landed in prison for a deadly robbery. By 1999, he was serving life at Telford State Prison in New Boston, Texas. That's where he joined the Aryan Brotherhood. Inside those walls, gangs ran everything. When something was stolen from a fellow member, Taylor stepped in to settle it his way. On April 1st in 1999, during the early morning walk to breakfast, Lee passed 22-year-old Donta Green in the corridor. Then he turned. First came a punch to the face, then a headlock, and then the stabbing, over and over. The weapon was a prison-made shank that looked like an ice pick. Donta never stood a chance. Another inmate, Daniel Richburg, helped by keeping others at bay with his own blade. During the attack, Lee shouted, "That's what you get for stealing," and bragged afterwards that he stabbed Donta at least 25 times. But later he claimed self-defense. Daniel was sentenced to 48 years for his role. Lee got the death penalty in 2000. He spent 11 years on death row. For his final meal, Lee ordered a medium pizza with cheese, beef, black olives, and mushrooms, 4 soft tacos, a large bowl of fried okra, and a pint of Bluebell ice cream. Just before the injection, Lee said, "There are 300 people on death row, and not every one of them is a monster. The state of Texas is carrying out a very inhuman and unjust situation. It's not right to kill anybody, not the way I did it, or the way it's being done to me. Everyone changes, right?" Turning to the victim's family, he added, "I defended myself when I killed your family member. Prison is a bad place. I didn't set out to kill him, but he would not have been in prison if he was a saint. I hope you all understand that. I hope you don't find satisfaction in this, watching a human being die." As the drugs entered his system, he looked up and said, "I'm ready to teleport." Lee Andrew Taylor was executed by lethal injection in Texas on June 16, 2011, at 6:24 p.m. He was 32 years old. But that wasn't all, as another execution was scheduled for the same day. In Alabama, Eddie Duval Powell was waiting for his final moments. Let's take a look. Before the sun rose on March 25, 1995, 70-year-old Mattie Wesson was asleep in her home in Tuscaloosa when Eddie Powell, a neighbor who lived just across the street, broke in. He raped her and shot her multiple times. But despite her injuries, Mattie managed to make it out her front door and across the street to her neighbor's yard. Before collapsing, she told them, "A black man raped and shot me." Those were her last words. When police began their investigation, Eddie denied everything. But the evidence told the truth. His handprint was found on Mattie's window where someone had cut the screen. Her blood was on his pants and on the jacket he borrowed from a friend. His semen was found in her mouth, anus, and vagina. And later that morning, Eddie showed up at another friend's house with a handgun and asked Jason Long to get rid of it, which he did. Jason later testified that Eddie told him he did the bitch and she ran up on me, so I shot her. And this was not Eddie's first encounter with the police. But this time, the crime was different. It was brutal. Eddie was sentenced to death in 1998. He spent 13 years on death row. He didn't request a special last meal. Instead, he ate sandwiches, corn chips, and drank soda from the prison vending machine. In his last words, Eddie said, "I'm sorry for the pain I have caused everyone who has had to deal with this situation, my family, the victim's family, and everyone in this state. I've made peace with myself and God, and hope that everyone can move on from this situation." Eddie Duval Powell III was executed by lethal injection in Alabama on June 16, 2011, at 6:30 p.m. He was 41 years old. That was brutal. Now let's see what the next death row inmate did and what he chose for his final meal. On the morning of December 15, 1998, 19-year-old Milton Mathis walked into a house in Fort Bend County that was known for drugs. Inside were 6 people, including his friend Travis Brown, a woman named Melanie Almaguer, her teenage daughter, and a man named Daniel Hibbard. At 8:30 a.m., Milton pulled out a handgun and shot Travis in the head. He then forced the others into a room and shot 15-year-old Melanie in the head before turning the gun on Daniel. After that, Milton pointed the gun at Melanie's mother and pulled the trigger, but the gun was out of bullets. He set Travis's room on fire, searched the house, threatened the others, and drove away in Travis's car. 15-year-old Melanie survived the shooting, but was left permanently paralyzed. Travis and Daniel died from their injuries. The survivors told police Milton was the shooter. At first, Milton convinced his girlfriend to give him an alibi, but she later admitted she'd lied. In jail, Milton reportedly showed no remorse. He told another inmate he wished he'd killed everyone in the house. Milton was sentenced to death in 1999. He spent 12 years on death row. For his final meal, he requested 5 bacon-loaded Texas burgers, 5 fried pork chops, 5 pieces of fried chicken, 5 pieces of fried fish, chili cheese fries with a whole jalapeno, regular fries, and a gallon of fruit punch. In his final words, he looked at Melanie. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. "You were just at the wrong place at the wrong time." He didn't ask for her forgiveness, but said he hoped she got better. Then he turned to the room and said, "The system has failed me. This is what you call a miscarriage of justice. Life is not supposed to end this way." Milton Mathis was executed by lethal injection in Texas on June 21, 2011, at 6:53 p.m. He was 32 years old. Some say that execution was justified, but it's hard to compare once you hear what came next. In the early morning of March 2, 1978, Roy Blankenship left a bar in Savannah after drinking and started walking home. As he passed a familiar apartment, he made a sudden decision. He knew the woman who lived there, 78-year-old Sarah Bowen. He had done repair work for her in the past, but that night he had different intentions. He climbed up to her porch, broke a window, and let himself in. Sarah was sleeping when Roy attacked her. He grabbed her from behind, and when she fell, he landed on top of her, and she lost consciousness. Roy then carried her to her bed and raped her. Neighbors later found her body naked, bloody, and bruised. She had been bitten, scratched, and beaten, and a bottle of lotion had been forced into her. The trauma of the attack caused a heart attack that killed her. Footprints outside the apartment matched Roy's unusual shoes. And that was not it. His fingerprints were inside the apartment, and blood under Sarah's fingernails matched his blood type. He confessed after his arrest, but later changed parts of his story. But it didn't matter. Roy was sentenced to death in 1980, and he spent the next 33 years on death row. When his final day came, he declined to request a special meal. Instead, he was served chicken and rice, peas, carrots, collard greens, cornbread, a brownie, and iced tea. As the drugs took effect, Roy looked toward the witnesses and said, "I hope to see you again." He was executed by lethal injection in Georgia on June 23, 2011, at 8:37 p.m. Roy Willard Blankenship was 55 years old. He was gone, but behind the bars, someone else was counting down the hours. On June 6, 1988, 9-year-old Jennifer Wilson set off on her bike for a short ride to her family's ranch near Flagstaff, but she never made it. For 3 weeks, her disappearance triggered a desperate search, and then came the heartbreak. Jennifer's naked body was found beneath a tree, covered in branches. Her hands were tied behind her back, and she'd been beaten to death with a blunt object. That next day, Richard Bible, who was just released from prison for kidnapping and sexual assault, was seen driving around in a stolen GMC Blazer. And after a high-speed chase, Richard was arrested. Inside the vehicle, police found rubber bands, mini vodka bottles, and broken car parts. At the crime scene, identical rubber bands and the same brand of vodka bottles were found near Jennifer's body. At the time, DNA testing was still new, but the evidence was strong. Blood found on Richard's shirt matched Jennifer's, and other forensic details backed it up. He was convicted of her murder in 1990. Richard spent the next 21 years on death row. For his final meal, he chose 4 eggs with cheese, hash browns, biscuits and gravy, peanut butter and jelly, and chocolate milk. Before the drugs were administered, Richard said, "I want to thank my family and my lawyers. I love them all, and everything's okay. That's it." He was executed by lethal injection in Arizona on June 30, 2011, at 11:11 a.m. Richard Lynn Bible was 49 years old. Now let's move on to the executions of July 2011. Keep watching, because some of them are outright disturbing. On May 21, 1994, a block party in San Antonio took a brutal turn. 16-year-old Adria Sauceda had been drinking, and witnesses saw her leave the party with a man who said he knew her mother. That man was Humberto Leal. About half an hour later, Humberto showed up at his house with blood on his clothes, and he told his brother he had killed a girl. Adria's body was found soon after, dumped on a dirt road nearby. She had been beaten to death with a large chunk of asphalt, and her body showed signs of a violent sexual assault. Bite marks were found on her neck, chest, and cheek, and a broken stick had been forced into her. It was a gruesome scene. Police searched Humberto's house and car that same day. They found Adria's blouse, stained with blood and other bodily fluids on Humberto's underwear. The car also had blood on the door and seat, and Humberto had scratches and cuts across his body. At first, he claimed Adria got angry in his car, jumped out, and ran off, but when police told him his brother had already talked, he changed his story. He said Adria attacked him, he pushed her, and she hit the ground and never got up. He claimed he panicked, went home, and told his family. Humberto was arrested, convicted of capital murder, and sentenced to death in 1995. He spent 16 years on death row. For his last meal, he chose fried chicken, tacos, fried okra, pico de gallo, and 2 Cokes. Before the drugs were administered, Humberto gave a short final statement. "I truly am sorry, that is all. I've hurt a lot of people. I take full blame for everything. I am sorry for what I did. May they forgive me. Let's get this show on the road, Warden. One more thing. Viva Mexico. Viva Mexico." Humberto was executed by lethal injection in Texas on July 7, 2011, at 6:21 p.m. He was 38 years old. As one case ended, another one was already moving toward the same outcome. On July 12, 1987, Thomas West went back to a trailer home outside Tucson. The man inside, 53-year-old Don Bortle, had met Thomas just weeks earlier when he came by with friends to look at some electronics. Don was selling, but this time Thomas wasn't there to buy anything. He tied Don up, beat him badly, and ransacked the place. He took electronics, loaded them into Don's car, and drove north to Phoenix, hoping to sell the stolen goods. But Thomas couldn't keep quiet. He bragged about what he'd done, and someone listening decided they'd heard enough. A friend of Thomas's tipped off the sheriff's department. Deputies found Don 5 days later. His body was still in the trailer, bound and gagged. He'd been beaten to death. Thomas was already on the run, but a traffic stop in Illinois ended it. Police found 4 boxes of Don's belongings in his car, mostly electronics. Thomas was arrested and sent back to Arizona. He was sentenced to death in 1988 and spent 23 years on death row. He declined a last meal and didn't say any final words. Thomas was executed by lethal injection in Arizona on July 19, 2011, at 11:10 a.m. He was 52 years old. You may have agreed with that sentence, but the next man gave the jury no choice. On October 4, 2001, just weeks after the 9/11 attacks, Mark Stroman walked into a convenience store in Mesquite, Texas. He had a .44 caliber gun in his hand and hate in his heart. Behind the counter was 49-year-old Vasudev Patel, a husband, father, and store owner. Mark pulled out the gun and shot Vasudev. But Vasudev wasn't Mark's first victim. Just weeks earlier, on September 15th, Mark shot and killed another man, Waqar Hassan, while he was cooking burgers in his grocery store. Then, on September 21st, he shot a third man, Raisuddin Puyan, in the face. Raisuddin survived. After he was arrested, Mark told police that he was angry about the September 11th attacks and wanted to get revenge on people he thought were from the Middle East. But all 3 of the men he attacked were innocent. None of them had anything to do with terrorism. Mark believed he was doing a patriotic act, but all he caused was pain. Police arrested Mark the same day he shot Vasudev. They found the gun he used and later learned he had talked about his crimes with others. He had even said he planned to go to a shopping mall and shoot more people. In court, Mark admitted to what he did. He was sentenced to death in 2002. Mark spent 9 years on death row. For his last meal, he ordered a huge amount of food: chicken fried steak with gravy, a ham and cheese omelet, bacon, fried potatoes, squash, okra, pork chops with eggs, a Dr. Pepper, and a pint of vanilla Bluebell ice cream. Before he died, Mark spoke to the room. "Hate is going on in this world, and it has to stop," he said. "1 second of hate will cause a lifetime of pain." He ended with, "Let's do this damn thing." Mark was executed by lethal injection in Texas on July 20th, 2011 at 8:53 p.m. Mark Stroman was 41 years old. Just 1 day later, the next execution took place. But what did he do, and what did he choose for his final meal? Let's take a look. In the early hours of June 14, 1993, 19-year-old Andrew DeYoung crept through the quiet of his parents' home with a knife in his hand and a plan already in motion. He and his friend, David Haggerty, weren't there to steal. They were there to kill. Andrew stabbed his mother, Catherine, as she slept. Her screams woke his father, Gary, who rushed in, only to be stabbed and slashed to death. Then came 14-year-old Sarah, his little sister, stepping into the hallway and straight into her brother's blade. But Andrew didn't stop until she, too, was dead. Only his 16-year-old brother, Nathan, survived. Waking to the sounds of violence, Nathan escaped out a window and ran to a neighbor's house to call 911. Police arrived quickly while Andrew was still at the scene. David later told police that Andrew planned to kill the entire family and burn the house down to cover it up. He believed he'd inherit $480,000 and use it to start a business. But that plan ended the moment Nathan survived. David testified against Andrew and received 3 life sentences. Andrew was sentenced to death in 1995 and spent 16 years on death row. For his last meal, he chose pizza, breadsticks, strawberry preserves, grape juice, and vanilla ice cream. Before the execution began, Andrew offered one final statement: "I'm sorry for everyone I've hurt." He was executed by lethal injection in Georgia on July 21, 2011, at 8:04 p.m. Andrew Grant DeYoung was 37 years old. With one life taken, another man was already in line to face the same fate. But what did he do, and what were his last words? Keep watching to find out. On April 3, 1992, 47-year-old Elizabeth Girardi came home to find her quiet suburban driveway wasn't empty. 2 young men had just broken into her house while she was away. Robert Jackson, only 18, and his friend Anthony Lachette had ransacked the place for valuables: jewelry, coins, CDs, even firecrackers, hoping to sell them for drug money. They'd just loaded up their bags and were about to leave when Elizabeth pulled in. Anthony ran, but Robert stayed. He ducked into a nearby shed, grabbed an axe, and waited. Moments later, he confronted Elizabeth and hit her several times in the face. By the time the attack ended, she was dead in her own driveway. Anthony later testified against Robert. He got a reduced sentence and walked free in 1996. Robert was sentenced to death in 1993. He spent 18 years on death row before his execution. For his final meal, Robert asked for steak, a baked potato, potato skins, corn, and a soda. Before the drugs took effect, he turned toward the witness room. "Are the Girardis in there? Christopher and Claudia, if you are in there, I've never faulted you for your anger. I would have been mad myself," he said. Then, blaming his co-defendant, he added, "Tony's laughing his ass off right now because you're about to watch an innocent man die. This isn't justice." He was executed by lethal injection in Delaware on July 29, 2011 at 12:12 a.m. Robert W. Jackson III was 38 years old. Don't click away now, because you don't want to miss the next one. In the early morning hours of November 12, 2002, 19-year-olds John Comiskey and Jesus Gonzalez were sleeping inside a small house in Corpus Christi. Martin Robles, just 24 at the time, walked in with fellow gang member Joe Magic Padron. Both were armed. It wasn't random. John and Jesus were part of a rival crew, and tensions had been building. What came next was fast and brutal. Gunfire erupted inside the home. Jesus was hit at least 15 times, mostly in the head, and John was shot 14 times, with most of the bullets tearing through his back. Neither had a chance. A third man, Antonio Ortiz, managed to run out the front door and call 911. He later testified that he recognized both shooters. He'd seen them before, and there was no mistaking their faces. By the time police arrived, the house was filled with shell casings and blood. It looked like an execution. When investigators tracked down Martin, he didn't deny being there. The jury found him guilty, and in 2003, he was sentenced to death. He spent 8 years on death row. Martin declined a special last meal, and he had only a few words. As the drugs entered his veins, he said, "I love you, Israel." He was executed by lethal injection in Texas on August 10, 2011, at 6:21 p.m. Martin Robles was 33 years old. What a story. Let's continue with the next one. On the night of August 26, 2001, 88-year-old Ruth Phillips was asleep in her small Williamsburg apartment when Jerry Jackson climbed through her window. She had lived a quiet life, known in the community as a retired seamstress, who mostly kept to herself. Jerry was just 20 years old, jobless, and looking for money. He found her purse and began rifling through it until she woke up. Ruth pleaded with him. She offered her money, her car, anything if he would just leave. But Jerry didn't. He forced her down, pressed a pillow over her face, and raped her. She suffocated during the assault. He then stole $60 and her car, drove off, and used the money to buy marijuana. Soon after, her body was found. Investigators found Jerry's fingerprint on papers inside her purse and his DNA in hair samples recovered from her bed. When police brought him in, Jerry admitted to breaking in and putting a pillow over her face. He said he hadn't meant to kill her, just wanted to keep her from identifying him. But the jury didn't accept that explanation. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 2003. He spent 8 years on death row. At his request, details of Jerry's final meal were kept private, and he made no final statement. Jerry Terrell Jackson was executed by lethal injection in Virginia on August 18, 2011, at 9:14 p.m. He was 30 years old. The next execution took place in September, and it would become one of the most controversial ones in Texas history, setting off public outrage and leading to drastic policy changes. But before we get to that, let's take a look at what this death row inmate did. On May 2, 2001, just outside Dallas, 2 men spotted a car parked off a quiet road near a golf course. Lying beside it were 2 bodies. Ron Whitehead, 21, had been shot 6 times in the head and slashed across the neck. Beside him, 19-year-old Bethina Bross was clinging to life with gunshot wounds and deep cuts across her throat. She was rushed to the hospital but didn't survive the night. Stephen Woods and his friend Marcus Rhoades had been seen with both victims hours earlier, and the evidence pointed towards them. Police searched Marcus's car and found a backpack and belongings that had belonged to the victims. The murder weapons turned up at Marcus's parents' house, and a latex glove with Stephen's DNA was found in Marcus's car. Soon after, multiple witnesses came forward. Before the murders, Stephen had talked about his plan to kill Ron, and afterward he described what happened in detail. Prosecutors said he wanted Ron dead because Ron knew too much about an earlier crime. Bethina was simply there, so they killed her too. Marcus Rhoades pleaded guilty and took a life sentence. Stephen went to trial and was sentenced to death in 2002. He spent 9 years on death row. For his last meal, Stephen ordered a feast: bacon, a meat-loaded pizza, fried chicken, chicken fried steak, hamburgers on French toast, garlic breadsticks, sweet tea, root beer, Mountain Dew, Pepsi, and ice cream. But Stephen didn't touch any of it. His final words were defiant. "You're not about to witness an execution, you're about to witness a murder. I've never killed anybody, never. This whole thing is wrong. Warden, if you're going to murder someone, go ahead and do it. Pull that trigger. Goodbye." Stephen Michael Woods Jr. was executed by lethal injection in Texas on September 13, 2011 at 6:22 p.m. He was 31 years old. The fact that he ordered a massive last meal but didn't touch a single bite didn't sit right. And after what this next inmate did, Texas took definitive action. In the early hours of June 7, 1998, Lawrence Russell Brewer and two other men pulled up beside 49-year-old James Byrd Jr., who was walking home alone in Jasper, Texas. They offered him a ride, which he accepted. What followed was one of the most brutal hate crimes in modern U.S. history. The three men, Lawrence, John King, and Sean Berry, drove him down a remote road. Then they jumped him, beat him unconscious, chained his ankles to the back of their truck, and dragged his body for nearly 3 miles along the pavement. James was still alive when the dragging began, but was torn apart before the truck finally stopped. His body was dumped outside a cemetery. Investigators found that Lawrence and John had been involved with white supremacist groups during their time in prison. John had plans to start a new chapter in Jasper, and prosecutors argued that James's murder was meant to send a message. Lawrence was convicted in 1999 and sentenced to death. He spent 12 years on death row. Lawrence requested an enormous final meal: chicken fried steaks, a triple meat bacon cheeseburger, fajitas, barbecue, pizza, ice cream, and peanut butter fudge. But when it arrived, he refused to eat any of it, just like Stephen just days earlier. This was the last straw, and Texas ended the tradition of special last meal requests for death row inmates. He offered no final words. Lawrence Brewer was executed by lethal injection in Texas on September 21, 2011 at 6:21 p.m. He was 44 years old. That was brutal. Now let's move on to the other executions scheduled for that same day. On August 19, 1989, in Savannah, Georgia, 20-year-old Troy Davis was hanging out near a Burger King when things turned violent. According to witnesses, a homeless man named Larry Young was attacked by Troy after refusing to share his beer with one of Troy's friends. As the altercation escalated, Larry was hit in the head with the gun. Nearby, 27-year-old Officer Mark McPhail heard the commotion. He was an off-duty police officer working security at the Greyhound bus station next door. He ran toward the chaos, still in full uniform. But before he could act, Troy took off running, and Mark followed. That's when it turned deadly. Troy stopped, turned around, and fired. One bullet hit Mark in the thigh, another pierced through the gap in his bulletproof vest, but Troy wasn't done just yet. He walked up calmly, looked down at the officer struggling for breath, and pulled the trigger again, this time shooting Mark in the face. Troy was arrested days later. Multiple witnesses placed him at the scene and identified him as the shooter. But over the years, several of those witnesses changed their stories or claimed they were pressured to testify. Doubt began to swirl, not just around the case, but around the system that had condemned him. Despite these doubts, Troy was sentenced to death. In 1991, he spent 20 years on death row. He declined a final meal. In his final moments, Troy faced the McPhail family. He denied killing Mark and insisted he was innocent. "The incident that happened that night is not my fault," he said. "I did not have a gun." Then, speaking to the executioners, he added, "God have mercy on your souls." Troy Davis was executed by lethal injection in Georgia on September 21, 2011 at 11:08 p.m. He was 42 years old. And while Troy's story was wrapping up, Derrick was executed just one day later. In the early morning hours of March 24, 1994, 19-year-old Derrick Mason walked into a convenience store in Huntsville, Alabama. Angela Cagle, 25, was working alone behind the counter. She probably didn't see him as a threat, just another customer passing through before sunrise. But Derrick wasn't there to buy anything. He pulled a handgun and forced Angela into the back room at gunpoint, demanding to know how to shut off the security camera. Angela couldn't give him what he wanted, and what happened next was fast and brutal. Derrick ordered her to undress, though whether out of humiliation or to stop her from running is unclear. Then he raised the gun and fired. The first shot hit her in the face. She fell, but Derrick wasn't finished. He shot her again, a second round to ensure she couldn't identify him later. He emptied the cash register and fled the scene, leaving Angela's body behind on the cold tile floor. For days, Derrick stayed silent, but his behavior caught up with him. An acquaintance went to police and said Derrick had been bragging, acting out, trying to build a name on violence. The man described the weapon and pointed officers to Derrick's car. Inside was the .380 handgun that had taken Angela's life. When confronted, he confessed. Derrick was arrested in 1994 and sentenced to death in 1995. He spent 16 years on death row. He declined a special last meal and ate what the other prisoners ate. In his final moments, he turned to Angela's family. He apologized for the pain he caused and thanked her father for reaching out and offering forgiveness years earlier. Derrick Mason was executed by lethal injection in Alabama on September 22, 2011, at 6:49 p.m. He was 37 years old. Let's continue with the next one, as 6 days later, another execution was scheduled. On April 2, 1978, 27-year-old Manuel Valle was driving a stolen Camaro through Coral Gables when Officer Louis Pena pulled him over for a traffic stop. Officer Pena approached Manuel's car to check the plates, unaware he was about to be ambushed. As Louis returned to his patrol car to run the information, Manuel calmly walked back to his own car, reached inside, and pulled out a handgun. Without a word, he turned, walked up to Officer Pena, and fired a single shot into his neck. The officer collapsed beside his car, dying on the spot. Another officer, Gary Spell, arrived moments later. Manuel didn't hesitate. He pointed the gun on him and fired 2 more shots. One bullet hit Gary in the back, but luckily his vest saved him, and he survived. Manuel took off after the shooting, triggering a manhunt across the city. It took the police 2 days before he was caught hiding in a friend's home. Manuel had no known connection to Louis or Gary. He didn't act out of revenge or fear. The killing was calculated and quick, a way to avoid arrest. But that single act bought him something else, a seat on death row that would last more than 3 decades. He was first sentenced to death in 1978, but legal challenges and retrials stretched his case across 33 years and multiple courts. But finally, a date was set, September 28, 2011. For his final meal, he had fried chicken breast, white rice, garlic toast, peach cobbler, and a Coca-Cola. He gave no final words before his execution. Manuel Valle was executed by lethal injection in Florida on September 28, 2011, at 7:14 p.m. He was 61 years old. As one case ended, another one was already moving toward the same outcome. But what happened? On February 18, 2005, in the quiet dark of early morning, 32-year-old Christopher Johnson woke up because of his crying baby son, Elias, who was only 6 months old. His wife was asleep nearby, unaware of the violence that was about to unfold. Christopher had made up his mind. He didn't want to pay child support, didn't want to deal with his wife's threats, and didn't want to be a father. He started by pressing his hand over Elias's mouth to muffle the cries. When that didn't work, he forced his fingers down the baby's throat. Then he hit the baby and lay on top of him, trying to silence his baby son so he wouldn't wake his mother. Eventually, Elias stopped making noise. An autopsy revealed Elias had suffered at least 85 injuries. The cause of death was suffocation and blunt force trauma. At trial, the jury listened as Christopher calmly explained why he killed his son, not out of rage, but because he wanted out of the family. He represented himself during parts of the trial and refused to appeal his sentence. He was arrested within days and sentenced to death in 2007. He spent 4 years on death row. For his final meal, he chose a turkey bologna sandwich with tomatoes and cheese, French fries, and an orange drink from the prison cafeteria. Later, from a vending machine, he added a Reese's cup, pretzels, and a grape Sunkist. When asked for final words, he offered only 2. Game over. He was executed by lethal injection in Alabama on October 20th, 2011 at 6:25 p.m. Christopher Thomas Johnson was 38 years old. Exactly 7 days later, another man was executed, this time in Texas. On February 29, 2001, in San Antonio, Texas, 28-year-old Frank Garcia came home from work furious. Just hours earlier, his wife Jessica had called her relatives for help leaving the house with their 2 children after a violent argument. Frank's mother, whom they lived with, had tipped him off about it, and when he arrived, he grabbed Jessica in a headlock and dragged her inside. Soon after, Officer Hector Garza arrived at the house for the second time that morning. Inside the bedroom, Officer Garza tried to separate the couple, but as he approached, Frank turned around and fired a MAC-10 machine pistol straight into the officer's head. Then he turned on Jessica, shooting her 6 times, killing her instantly. Frank stormed outside and fired wildly until his weapon was empty. Then he went inside again, picking up an AK-47, and shot Officer Garza again as he lay on the ground. He went back outside, still firing, hitting Jessica's uncle and even hitting a nearby elementary school. When Garza's partner pulled up, Frank dropped his rifle, raised his hands, and surrendered. "I give up," he said. He told officers he aimed for Garza's head because he knew police wore bulletproof vests. Then he said, "I went crazy." He was arrested that day, convicted, and sentenced to death the following year. He spent 9 years on death row. By the time of his execution, Texas had ended the tradition of granting final meal requests, and Frank was served the same food as the other inmates. When asked for his last words, he said, "Thank you for this. My God is a God of salvation. Only through you, Jesus Christ, people will see that you're still on the throne. For this reason, I was born and raised. Thank you for this miracle you are performing in my life. My God is holy, holy, holy. Hallelujah." He continued shouting, "Thank you, Yahweh," until he lost consciousness. He was executed by lethal injection in Texas on October 27, 2011 at 7:02 p.m. Frank Garcia was 39 years old. That was brutal, but wait until you hear what this next inmate did. On the morning of March 6, 1982, in East Cleveland, Ohio, Reginald Brooks waited until his wife Beverly left for work, then turned a quiet house into a crime scene. He walked into his son's bedrooms one by one and shot each of them in the head while they slept. Reginald Jr. was 17, Vaughn was 15, and Niarchos was just 11. He left their bodies where they lay and got on a bus to Las Vegas, carrying the .38 caliber handgun in his suitcase. The family had been falling apart for years. Reginald had quit his job in 1976 and never worked again, forcing Beverly to support all 5 of them. Their marriage steadily fractured, and just days before the murders, Beverly filed for divorce. Reginald said nothing, but 10 days before the shooting, he secretly took a cash advance on a credit card and bought the gun. 2 days after being served the divorce papers, he carried out his plan without warning or remorse. He was arrested days later in Utah, and police recovered the murder weapon from his luggage. He was convicted and sentenced to death on November 30, 1983, and spent 28 years on death row. For his final meal, Reginald ordered a large meal that included lasagna, chili cheese fries, garlic bread, Moose Tracks ice cream, chocolate cake, caramel candy, beef jerky, cashews, almonds, and root beer. He had no last words, but before the injection began, he raised both hands and gave the middle finger to the witnesses. Reginald Brooks was executed by lethal injection in Ohio on November 15, 2011, at 2:04 p.m. He was 66 years old. Some say that execution was justified, but it's hard to compare once you hear what came next. On June 1, 1989, the Rogers family's vacation turned into a nightmare. Joan Rogers, a 36-year-old mother from rural Ohio, had brought her daughters Michelle, 17, and Krista, 14, down to Florida for their first beach trip, but they never made it home. That evening, the three stopped to ask a man for directions to their motel. He seemed helpful and friendly. His name was Oba Chandler, and he offered them a boat ride to watch the sunset over Tampa Bay, which they excitedly agreed to. But no one knew that the next time anyone saw them, they would be dead. Despite the concrete blocks, their bodies surfaced and were found days later, naked from the waist down. All three had been thrown overboard alive. Police were left with almost nothing, just a brochure in their car, scribbled with a stranger's handwriting. That clue sat cold for 3 years, until detectives put it on a billboard under the words, "Who killed the Rogers family?" One of Oba's former neighbors recognized his handwriting and called it in. And that was not all, as Oba bore a striking resemblance to a composite sketch of a suspect wanted in an earlier, still unsolved assault involving a Canadian woman who'd been raped aboard a boat in Tampa Bay. Oba was arrested in 1992 and sentenced to death in 1994. He spent 17 years on death row, and in that time, not a single friend or family member ever came to visit. For his final meal, Oba asked for 2 salami sandwiches with mustard and a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. He ate only half of it. He requested iced tea, but ended up drinking coffee instead. He had no final words. Oba Chandler was executed by lethal injection in Florida on November 15, 2011, at 4:25 p.m. He was 65 years old. As one case ended, another one was already moving toward the same outcome. As 1 day later, Guadalupe Esparza was executed in Texas. On June 30, 1999, in San Antonio, 7-year-old Alyssa Vasquez disappeared from her home. Her mother had stepped out, leaving a babysitter in charge. However, the babysitter left her alone to visit a neighbor, and when she returned, the little girl was gone. Just moments later, she saw a man, who later appeared to be Guadalupe Esparza, running down the street. Shortly after, Alyssa's body was found in a nearby field. She had been raped and strangled. Guadalupe was a registered sex offender with a rape conviction dating back to 1985. He lived just 2 miles away. Police quickly focused their attention on him, and a blood-stained shirt and boxer shorts were found in a trash bin near his home. DNA tests on these items linked him to the assault. He later confessed the murder to a jailhouse informant and a guard. He was arrested and charged in 1999. In 2001, a jury sentenced him to death. Guadalupe declined to request a special last meal. When asked for final words, he looked toward the victim's family. "To the family of Alyssa Vasquez, I hope you will find peace in your heart. My sympathy goes out to you. I hope you find it in your heart to forgive me. I don't know why all of this happened." He was executed by lethal injection in Texas on November 16, 2011, at 6:21 p.m. He spent 10 years on death row. Guadalupe Esparza was 46 years old. And that brings us to the last death row inmate executed in 2011, Paul Ezra Rhoades. On February 28, 1987, in Blackfoot, Idaho, 21-year-old Stacy Baldwin was working alone at a red mini barn convenience store when Paul Rhoades approached. He abducted her at gunpoint, drove her out of town, and shot her several times. She bled out in the dark, dying an hour and a half later. Less than 3 weeks later, he struck again. On March 17th, 23-year-old student Nolan Haddon was found shot to death inside the walk-in cooler of Buck's convenience store in Idaho Falls. And that was not it. 2 days after killing Nolan on March 19th, Paul targeted 34-year-old Susan Michelbacher, a special education teacher. He forced her into his car in a parking lot, made her withdraw cash, drove her to a remote area of land, raped her, and then shot her 9 times. Paul was arrested in 1988 and tried separately for each murder. He received 2 death sentences, one for Stacy, another for Susan. For the killing of Nolan, he got life without parole. For his final meal, Paul was served the same food offered to all inmates at Idaho, maximum security. Hot dogs with the usual fixings, baked beans, veggie sticks, ranch dressing, fruit with gelatin, and strawberry ice cream. When asked if he had any final words, Paul spoke directly to the families. To Bert Michelbacher, I am sorry for the part I played in your wife's death. For Haddon and Baldwin, I can't help you. You still have to keep looking. I'm sorry for your family. I can't help you. I took part in the Michelbacher murder. I can't help you guys. I'm sorry. Then he turned to his mother and said, "Goodbye." His last words were to the warden or executioner. I forgive you, I really do. He was executed by lethal injection in Idaho on November 18, 2011, at 9:15 p.m. after spending 23 years on death row. Paul Ezra Rhoades was 54 years old. That concludes all executions carried out in 2011. If you liked this video, make sure to check out the next one because just when you thought it couldn't get worse, well, it can. And the next cases are even more disturbing.